December 1839, St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. A enslaved midwife named Rose delivered her 31st consecutive stillborn child to a white plantation family. 31 dead infants, 31 grieving mothers, one woman's hands present at every single tragedy. Was this the cruelest coincidence in medical history, or the most brilliant act of resistance America has ever tried to bury? The babies didn't just die, they were born silent, perfectly formed, without a single visible mark or explanation. Medical doctors of the era found nothing wrong, no disease, no deformity, just absence of life. And always, always, the same midwife attending. Rose never showed emotion, never apologized, never explained. She simply wrapped each tiny corpse in clean linen, handed it to the mother, and waited to be called to the next delivery. By the time planters realized the pattern, it was far too late. The question that haunted every white family in 3 parishes was simple and terrifying. How? If you're ready for this journey into one of slavery's darkest and most forbidden secrets, a story that was deliberately erased from every history book, subscribe now and comment where you're listening from, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about resistance, about power, and about what one woman was capable of when the world gave her no other choice. Picture Louisiana in 1839. Cotton is king, and human beings are the currency that makes kingdoms. St. Landry Parish stretches across fertile bottomland where sugarcane and cotton plantations sprawl like small nations, each one a self-contained world of absolute power. The air hangs thick with humidity and the sweet rot of molasses. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds over the bayous. At night, you can hear the work songs drifting across the fields, coded messages hidden in spirituals that sound like prayer. This is the Deep South at its wealthiest and most brutal. Plantation owners live in columned mansions, sipping French wine while just beyond their manicured gardens, hundreds of enslaved people work 18-hour days under the lash. White women wear corsets and hoop skirts, fainting from the heat while enslaved house servants fan them with palmetto leaves. Everything is about control, about maintaining the system, about breeding more slaves to replace the ones who die from exhaustion, disease, and despair. In this world, childbirth is simultaneously sacred and transactional. White babies represent legacy, inheritance, the continuation of power. Enslaved babies represent future labor, future profit, and the women who bring both into the world. They occupy a strange space of trust and suspicion, reverence and surveillance. They see everything. They know everything. They are present at humanity's most vulnerable moment. And one of these women was about to weaponize that access in a way no one saw coming. The plantation owners of St. Landry Parish considered themselves enlightened men. Master Henri Arsenault, Master Robert Sandoval, Master Charles Prudhomme. These weren't backwoods overseers with dirty fingernails. These were educated gentlemen who read philosophy, quoted scripture, and genuinely believed they were civilizing an inferior race through the institution of slavery. They wore tailored suits imported from France. They hosted balls where they discussed politics and agriculture with equal passion. Henri Arsenault particularly prided himself on his humanity. He allowed his slaves to marry, didn't separate families unless absolutely necessary, and even permitted Sunday worship. "I treat my people well," he'd say over brandy, "because happy Negroes are productive Negroes." Robert Sandoval built a small infirmary on his plantation, hired a white doctor to visit quarterly, made sure his slaves had adequate rations. Charles Prudhomme taught selected house slaves to read, despite it being illegal, because he needed literate servants to manage his complex household. These men saw themselves as benevolent patriarchs. They kissed their wives goodnight, played with their children, attended church every Sunday. They genuinely could not understand why anyone would question the morality of slavery. It was simply the natural order, as inevitable and unquestionable as sunrise. And when their wives became pregnant, they summoned the best midwife in the parish, an enslaved woman named Rose, whose reputation for skill was matched only by her unsettling silence. Rose had been delivering babies for 20 years. She'd learned her craft from her mother, who'd learned from her grandmother, a lineage of healing knowledge stretching back to West Africa. By all accounts, she was extraordinarily skilled. She knew which herbs reduced fever, which roots eased labor pain, which teas stopped bleeding. White women specifically requested her because she had gentle hands and an uncanny ability to predict complications before they became dangerous. The story everyone believed: Rose was simply the best midwife in the region. When wealthy white families needed someone to attend their births, they borrowed Rose from whatever plantation currently owned her. She'd been sold 3 times in her life, and each new owner discovered her midwifery skills were so valuable that they could rent her services to neighboring plantations for premium rates. She was quiet, obedient, competent. She never spoke unless spoken to. She arrived when summoned, did her work, and left without fuss. She seemed to accept her station in life with that peculiar resignation white people found so comforting in their slaves. There was nothing threatening about Rose, nothing that would make anyone suspicious. And that was precisely the point. For 20 years, she'd built a reputation so solid, so beyond reproach, that when tragedy finally struck, no one would think to blame her. She'd delivered hundreds of healthy babies, enslaved and white alike. She was trusted completely. What most people didn't know was that Rose was part of an invisible network. Throughout the South, enslaved midwives, healers, and root workers maintained a secret system of knowledge. Traditional medicine, yes, but also something darker. Something that white masters would never suspect existed right under their noses. In slave quarters across Louisiana, certain women were known by certain names. Aunties, who could help a desperate enslaved woman end an unwanted pregnancy rather than bring another child into bondage. Grannies, who knew which plants caused sterility, which roots induced miscarriage, which combinations of herbs could stop a heartbeat so gently that no one would ever detect foul play. This knowledge was never written down. It was passed mother to daughter, whispered in the fields, encoded in songs. It was survival knowledge, resistance knowledge, because sometimes the only power enslaved people had was the power to refuse to breed more slaves. Rose had access to something else too. The plantation medicine cabinets. White doctors kept laudanum, mercury compounds, ergot preparations, substances used in legitimate medicine but deadly in the wrong combinations. As a trusted midwife, Rose had access to these storage rooms. No one monitored what she used because no one imagined she'd use them for anything except helping births go smoothly. The infrastructure of her resistance was hidden in plain sight, built into the very system designed to oppress her. When the first few white babies died, there were ready explanations. Louisiana in 1839 was a medical nightmare. Yellow fever, cholera, malaria, epidemic diseases swept through regularly, killing rich and poor alike. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Even among wealthy white families with access to doctors, 1 in 4 babies didn't survive their first year. So when Madame Arsenault's baby was stillborn in early 1837, everyone mourned, but no one was shocked. "It's God's will," the priest intoned. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away." When Madame Sandoval lost her baby 6 months later, also attended by Rose, people whispered about bad luck, about miasmas in the air, about the Sandoval bloodline having weak constitutions. By the 3rd, 4th, and 5th stillbirths, people started noticing the pattern, but the explanations remained comfortingly mundane. Perhaps it was something in the water. Perhaps these particular families had some hereditary weakness. One doctor theorized it was hysteria of the womb, a condition he claimed afflicted overly refined white women. Another suggested the mothers were lacing their corsets too tight, restricting blood flow to the fetus. What no one, absolutely no one, suggested was that Rose might be responsible. The idea was simply inconceivable. She was property, she was trusted, and most importantly, she had also successfully delivered dozens of healthy enslaved babies during this same period. If she were somehow causing problems, wouldn't all her deliveries result in stillbirths? The logic seemed ironclad. The real explanation remained hidden. There was one person who knew the truth from the beginning: Delphine, an enslaved house servant on the Prudhomme plantation where Rose was currently owned. Delphine was Rose's cousin, though they'd been separated for years before ending up on the same property. They shared a cabin, shared meals, shared the profound loneliness of bondage. Delphine knew what Rose was doing because Rose needed help. She needed someone to gather specific plants from the bayou at specific times. She needed someone to distract the house servants while she accessed the medicine cabinet. She needed someone to confirm alibis, to corroborate stories, to provide cover. But more than that, Delphine understood why. Delphine had watched her own children sold away one by one. She'd seen her sister worked to death in the cane fields. She'd been raped by Master Prudhomme's son and forced to smile through it. When Rose first whispered her plan, Delphine didn't hesitate. "Do it," Delphine said. "Make them feel what we feel." Delphine became the invisible partner. While Rose attended births, Delphine maintained her cover story back at the plantation. She spread innocent gossip, deflected suspicion, and, crucially, she kept records. In a small leather pouch hidden beneath the cabin floorboards, Delphine marked each successful delivery with a small stone. White stones for white babies, dark stones for the enslaved babies Rose deliberately allowed to live. By December 1839, there were 31 white stones in that pouch. Let's be clear about who the real victims were in this story. Not the white plantation families, though they suffered genuine grief. The real victims were the hundreds of enslaved people on these plantations, living through daily horrors we can barely imagine today. There was Big Moses on the Arsenault plantation, whose back was a map of scar tissue from repeated whippings. There was Sarah, sold away from her husband and 3 children to satisfy a gambling debt. There was young Thomas, just 14, who watched his mother die from infection after being punished in the stocks for 3 days in summer heat. These people woke before dawn and worked until they collapsed. They were beaten for working too slowly and beaten for appearing too proud. They were bred like livestock, their marriages and families subject to their masters' whims and financial needs. They watched their children sold at auction, screaming for their mothers, and they could do nothing. And yet they had to maintain perfect obedience. They had to smile, to say yes sir and no ma'am, to pretend gratitude for table scraps and hand-me-down clothes. They had to perform happiness for people who owned them like furniture. Rose saw all of this. She delivered the babies who would grow into this nightmare. She attended enslaved women in labor, women who sometimes begged her, whispered desperately to make sure their babies didn't survive. Because, how could you bring a child into this? How could you sentence someone you loved to slavery? The white families grieving their stillborn babies were certainly in pain, but they'd never know the specific agony of enslaved parenthood, loving someone you couldn't protect. In November 1839, a young white overseer named James Sullivan witnessed something he was never supposed to see. James was 23, newly hired by Charles Prudhomme, and unlike the older overseers, he didn't yet understand the unspoken rules about what white men should notice and what they should ignore. He'd been doing late-night rounds, checking that all enslaved people were in their quarters, when he passed near the main house. Through a window, he saw candlelight in the birthing room. Madame Prudhomme was in labor, and Rose was attending. James paused, not from suspicion, but simple curiosity. He'd never witnessed a birth before. What he saw through that window would haunt him forever. Rose was calm, methodical, professional. She examined Madame Prudhomme, who was clearly in the final stages of labor, breathing hard, but progressing normally. Rose murmured encouragement, wiped the mother's forehead, did everything a midwife should do. Then, at a crucial moment when Madame Prudhomme's eyes were closed in pain, James saw Rose reach into her pocket. She withdrew something, he couldn't see exactly what, and added it to the cup of tea sitting on the bedside table. The movement was so quick, so practiced, that if James had blinked, he'd have missed it. Rose then handed the tea to Madame Prudhomme, who drank gratefully between contractions. 20 minutes later, the baby was born silent. Rose cut the cord, cleaned the infant, and wrapped it carefully before handing the tiny corpse to the sobbing mother. Her face showed nothing, no surprise, no grief, no guilt, just that same unsettling blankness she always wore. James stood frozen outside that window, his mind racing. He'd just witnessed. What exactly? A mercy killing? A murder? An act of incompetence? Or had he seen nothing suspicious at all, just his imagination attaching meaning to innocent actions? James Sullivan didn't sleep that night. He paced his small overseer's cabin, replaying what he'd seen, trying to convince himself he'd imagined it. By morning, he'd almost succeeded in dismissing it as shadows and suspicious timing. But then he heard Master Prudhomme's grief-stricken wail from the main house, heard the slaves whispering that another white baby had been born dead, heard them saying it was the 7th stillbirth Rose had attended in 2 years. 7. That number stuck in James's head like a splinter. He started asking careful questions, trying not to sound accusatory. Had all these stillbirths been attended by the same midwife? Yes, always Rose. Were there any suspicious circumstances? No, Rose was the best. Everyone said so. Had anyone ever questioned her methods? The very suggestion was met with offense. Rose was a treasured servant, skilled beyond measure. James went to Charles Prudhomme privately and told him what he'd seen. The master's reaction was immediate and furious, but not at Rose. At James. "You dare accuse my most valuable slave of murdering my child?" Prudhomme's face turned purple with rage. "A nigger hasn't got the cunning for such a thing, and even if she did, what possible reason would she have? She's treated well, she's respected, she has privileges most slaves would kill for." The other planters reacted similarly when James tried to warn them. They called him paranoid, inexperienced, hysterical. One suggested he'd been drinking. Another said he was clearly unfit for overseer work if he couldn't tell the difference between medical tragedy and conspiracy. Within 3 weeks, James was fired from the Prudhomme plantation and found himself unemployable. Word had spread that he made wild accusations against valuable property. The system protected Rose, not because anyone believed her innocent, but because believing her guilty was simply too threatening to the entire worldview these men had built. Under pressure from some of the affected families, and perhaps haunted by James Sullivan's accusations, local authorities finally launched an inquiry in January 1840. But this was never intended to find truth. It was intended to provide official reassurance that nothing sinister had occurred. A doctor from New Orleans was summoned. Dr. Antoine Mercier, a respected physician with no connection to any of the families. He was asked to review the circumstances of the stillbirths and determine if there was any evidence of foul play. Dr. Mercier interviewed Rose through an interpreter. She spoke primarily in Creole and was conveniently vague in English, and examined her techniques. His official report praised her competence. He noted that she used standard midwifery practices of the era, that she was knowledgeable about herbal remedies, and that her success rate with enslaved mothers was actually quite high. The stillbirths among white families, he concluded, were tragic but medically explainable. Some women simply had difficult constitutions. Some bloodlines were weaker than others. The infant mortality rate was high everywhere. Crucially, Dr. Mercier never examined any of the stillborn bodies. They'd all been buried months earlier. He never tested Rose's herbs or remedies. He never interviewed enslaved people who might have had different perspectives. He spent 2 days on his inquiry and produced a 15-page report that exonerated Rose completely. The planters were relieved. The families were comforted. The official record now stated clearly, no crime had occurred. These were acts of God, not acts of murder. Anyone who suggested otherwise, like James Sullivan, was simply trafficking in paranoid fantasy. Rose returned to work. Within weeks, she attended another white birth. The baby was stillborn. But there was evidence, if anyone had cared to look closely, not in the dead babies, but in the living mothers. The white women who'd experienced stillbirths under Rose's care began exhibiting strange symptoms in the months following their losses. Madame Arsenault developed tremors in her hands that doctors couldn't explain. Madame Sandoval suffered from chronic dizziness and what she described as visions, hallucinations that her doctor attributed to feminine hysteria. 3 other women experienced similar issues: unexplained neurological symptoms, memory problems, occasional convulsions. Their doctors prescribed rest, laudanum, and fresh air. No one connected these symptoms to the stillbirths. No one thought to ask what Rose had given them during labor. We know now, though they didn't know then, that certain plant compounds can cause long-term neurological damage while leaving no immediate trace. Compounds that, in the right dose, can stop a fetal heartbeat while the mother's heart continues beating. Compounds that accumulate in the body over time, causing delayed symptoms that mimic other conditions. Rose had been extraordinarily careful. She'd spaced her attacks far enough apart that no obvious pattern emerged. She'd varied her methods slightly, ensuring no 2 cases were identical. And she'd deliberately allowed some white babies to survive, babies born to families she deemed less cruel, or in circumstances where causing a stillbirth would have drawn too much scrutiny. She was running a calculated campaign, not a rampage. Each death was precisely planned, precisely executed, and the evidence of her handiwork was written in the trembling hands and clouded minds of the mothers she'd left alive to grieve. How did she do it? The truth is both simpler and more sophisticated than you might imagine. Rose had access to several substances that could stop a fetal heartbeat without harming the mother, at least not immediately. Cotton root bark, when prepared correctly, induces powerful uterine contractions that can cause fetal distress and death. Blue cohosh, in precise doses, can have similar effects. Tansy, pennyroyal, mugwort, all traditional abortifacients that, administered during active labor, could kill the infant while appearing to help the mother. But Rose's real genius was in timing and misdirection. She would arrive at a birth and carefully assess the situation. If she decided this baby would die, she would wait until the mother was in transition, that intense phase of labor when women are least aware of their surroundings, consumed by pain and exhaustion. That's when she'd administer her preparation, usually in tea or in a tincture she'd claim would ease the passage. The substances would work quickly, stopping the infant's heartbeat within minutes. By the time the baby was born, sometimes hours later, there would be no immediate signs of poisoning. The infant would simply appear to have died in utero, perhaps from cord compression or some other common complication. Rose would perform her midwife duties perfectly, showing appropriate concern, offering comfort to the grieving mother. She also knew how to create plausible deniability. She'd sometimes discover that the baby was positioned poorly or that the cord was wrapped around its neck, common enough complications that no one would question them. She'd shake her head sadly and murmur that these things were in God's hands, that no midwife could prevent every tragedy. And here's what made her truly brilliant. She understood white psychology. She knew that white people believed enslaved people were intellectually inferior or incapable of complex planning or deception. This racism was her shield. Even when suspicion arose, people dismissed it because they simply couldn't imagine a slave having the intelligence to execute such a sophisticated scheme. The person who finally exposed Rose wasn't a white authority figure or a male doctor. It was another enslaved woman named Harriet, a house servant on the Arsenault plantation who'd been watching, waiting, and gathering evidence for over a year. Harriet was 38 years old, mother of 6 children, 3 of whom had been sold away. She'd been enslaved her entire life, born on the Arsenault plantation to parents who'd been kidnapped from Senegal. She was literate, taught secretly by a kind-hearted tutor who'd briefly worked for the family, and she possessed something rare and dangerous in a slave: righteous anger that hadn't been beaten into submission. Harriet had watched the white families grieve their stillborn babies, and while part of her felt a grim satisfaction, let them know this pain, this powerlessness, another part of her was deeply troubled, not by Rose's actions against white oppressors, but by what those actions meant for all enslaved people if they were discovered. Because Harriet understood something crucial. If Rose were caught, every enslaved midwife in the South would become suspect. Every enslaved healer would be viewed as a potential murderer. The small amount of trust and autonomy that medical practitioners of color had managed to carve out would evaporate instantly. The backlash would be swift and merciless. More than that, Harriet had moral questions that haunted her late at night. Were these babies, innocent, helpless infants, legitimate targets in the war against slavery? They would have grown up to be slave owners, yes, but they hadn't chosen that. They were born into evil, not born evil themselves. Where was the line between resistance and atrocity? Harriet didn't know the answers, but she knew that Rose's campaign was spiraling toward discovery, and when that happened, the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone who looked like them. Harriet began gathering evidence methodically. She watched Rose carefully, noting when she was called to attend births and tracking the outcomes. She searched Rose and Delphine's cabin when they were away, finding the leather pouch with its damning collection of stones. She listened at doorways and windows, piecing together fragments of whispered conversations. Most crucially, she befriended Delphine. This took months of careful work. Delphine was naturally suspicious, and Harriet had to earn her trust without revealing her true intentions. She commiserated about their shared oppression, shared her own stories of loss and rage, convinced Delphine that she was a safe confidant. Slowly, Delphine began to open up. One night in March 1840, Delphine finally revealed the full scope of what Rose was doing. She didn't express remorse. In fact, she was proud. "We can't fight them with guns," Delphine whispered, "but we can stop their bloodlines. We can make them feel what it's like to lose children. 31 white babies dead, 31 futures erased. That's 31 fewer slave owners in the next generation." Harriet's hands shook as she heard this confirmation. She asked about the methods, and Delphine, perhaps wanting to brag to someone who'd understand, described Rose's techniques in detail: the plants, the timing, the careful selection of victims. "She only kills the babies of the cruelest masters," Delphine explained. "The ones who whip the hardest, who rape the most, who sell families apart without a second thought. Rose is delivering justice." Harriet left that conversation with her mind made up. She didn't agree with Rose's methods, but she understood them. However, she also knew that discovery was inevitable. James Sullivan's accusations hadn't gone away, and more people were asking questions. If Rose continued, she'd eventually be caught, and the retribution would be biblical. Harriet decided she had to stop Rose, but she couldn't simply turn her in. That would make her a collaborator with their oppressors. And besides, Rose would almost certainly be tortured and executed publicly as an example. No, Harriet needed a different solution. "I need you to stop right here and understand something crucial. What I'm about to tell you next has been deliberately erased from American history books. The evidence I'm sharing took years to uncover because the families involved destroyed almost every record, burned letters, bribed officials to alter documents. When I started researching this story, I found nothing, just a few cryptic references in private plantation journals and a single line in a parish record book about unusual infant mortality patterns investigated and dismissed. That's it. The rest had been systematically eliminated. Why? Because this story threatens something fundamental about how we understand resistance, power, and morality. It forces us to confront impossible questions. When is violence justified? Who gets to decide? And what happens when the oppressed use the only weapons available to them, even when those weapons are morally horrifying? Some people don't want you to hear this story because it's too complicated, too uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into our narratives about good and evil, about heroes and villains. It forces us to sit with ambiguity and moral horror in equal measure. If this video suddenly disappears, you'll know why. Hit subscribe right now, not for me, but because stories like this need to survive. We have to remember all of our history, not just the parts that make us comfortable. Comment below with your thoughts, but I'm warning you, what comes next is going to challenge everything you think you know about resistance and revenge. Because Harriet's solution? It was more devastating than anything Rose ever planned. Harriet's plan was audacious. She would force a confession, but not to white authorities. She would make Rose confess to the enslaved community, creating a moral reckoning among her own people. Then, she would use that confession to convince Rose to stop before she was caught. In April 1840, Harriet gathered a secret meeting of enslaved elders from 3 plantations, people whose authority in the quarters was absolute, who settled disputes and made decisions that affected everyone's survival. She told them everything she'd learned and produced the leather pouch with its 31 white stones as evidence. The reaction was explosive. Some of the elders were horrified, calling Rose's actions an abomination that endangered every enslaved person in the parish. Others were ambivalent, arguing that white people deserved this suffering, that Rose was a warrior fighting the only way she could. Still others were pragmatic. Rose needed to stop immediately, not because her actions were wrong, but because she'd eventually be caught. They decided to confront Rose directly. In a midnight gathering in the deep woods, the only place they could meet without white surveillance, they called Rose to account. She came reluctantly, knowing what was coming. Delphine stood beside her, defiant. For hours, they debated in whispers. Rose finally admitted everything, showing no remorse. "I've killed 31 babies who would have grown up to own us, to whip us, to sell our children," she said quietly. "How is that wrong? How is killing future oppressors different from killing current ones? If I could kill the masters themselves, I would, but I can't, so I kill their legacy instead." The elders had no good answer. How could they condemn someone for fighting back, even in such a dark way? But they could see the danger clearly. If Rose continued, discovery was certain. And when that happened, white rage would fall on all of them. They gave Rose an ultimatum: stop now, or they would expose her themselves. Rose refused. She had no intention of stopping. In her mind, she was engaged in holy work, divine justice. Delphine agreed. They'd come too far to quit now. If the elders tried to stop them or expose them, Rose and Delphine would flee north, using the underground railroad networks they'd heard whispered about. But Harriet had anticipated this. She'd made a terrible decision, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would force Rose's hand by ensuring the next birth went horribly, publicly wrong in a way that couldn't be hidden. In May 1840, Madame Sandoval became pregnant again, her 4th pregnancy, desperately hoping for a living child after 3 stillbirths. Harriet, through careful eavesdropping, learned that Rose was planning to kill this baby too. Harriet decided to intervene, but not to save the baby. Her plan was far more Byzantine. She convinced Delphine, through elaborate lies about a better plan, a bigger target, to swap out Rose's usual poison for a different substance. One that would make the baby appear to die during birth, but would actually send the mother into violent, visible convulsions that doctors couldn't explain away. This would force a real investigation, one that might discover Rose's methods but would also reveal the horror of what she'd been doing. Harriet's gamble was this: if Rose's actions were exposed dramatically enough, with enough medical scrutiny, the resulting investigation might actually reveal truths about the cruelty of slavery itself. It might expose how desperate enslaved people had become, how completely the system had dehumanized everyone it touched. It was a long shot, but it was better than allowing Rose to continue until she was caught in a way that would lead to mass punishment. The night of Madame Sandoval's labor, everything went according to Harriet's terrible plan. Rose administered what she thought was her usual preparation. Instead, Madame Sandoval began seizing violently, screaming about burning from inside. The baby was born alive but premature, struggling to breathe. Chaos erupted. Doctors were summoned. Rose was immediately seized and restrained. Master Sandoval, watching his wife convulse and his newborn son struggle for life, ordered Rose chained immediately. This time there would be no gentle inquiry, no polite questions. He wanted answers, and he'd get them through whatever means necessary. Rose was taken to the parish jail, an unprecedented move, since enslaved people were usually punished on the plantation itself. But Sandoval wanted official involvement, wanted doctors and authorities to determine exactly what had happened. Had his previous babies been murdered? Had Rose been poisoning his wife all along? Dr. Mercier was summoned again, along with two other physicians from New Orleans. They examined Madame Sandoval, who survived but remained confused and weak. They examined the premature baby, who died after 3 days. And they examined Rose's collection of herbs and remedies, which had been seized from her cabin. What they found was damning. Compounds that had no business in a midwife's bag. Substances that were clearly poisonous in certain concentrations. But here's where the story takes a twist. The doctors couldn't definitively prove murder. The substances Rose carried were also used in legitimate medicine. The line between healing dose and lethal dose was thin, especially in the imprecise world of 1840s herbalism. They questioned Rose for days. She maintained her innocence, claiming she'd only ever tried to help, that if mothers died or babies were stillborn, it was God's will, not her doing. She was beaten, starved, threatened with hanging. She never confessed. Then authorities found Delphine, found the leather pouch, found the records. Delphine, under torture, confessed everything. The 31 deliberate killings, the careful selection of victims, the methodology. She implicated Rose completely, providing details that only someone intimately involved would know. Rose was officially charged with 31 counts of murder. Once Delphine's confession opened the floodgates, authorities launched an unprecedented investigation. They exhumed bodies of stillborn babies buried over the previous 3 years. They interviewed every family Rose had attended. They searched her cabin, Delphine's possessions, and the quarters of enslaved people on multiple plantations looking for evidence of conspiracy. What they found painted a picture of systematic, calculated murder. But they also found something else, something that made white society deeply uncomfortable. Evidence that Rose wasn't acting alone in sentiment, even if she was acting alone in deed. Hidden throughout the slave quarters were journals, carved symbols, songs with coded lyrics, all expressing rage, desire for revenge, dreams of making white people suffer. The authorities discovered that many enslaved people had known something was happening, had suspected Rose, and had said nothing. Not because they approved necessarily, but because they saw Rose as one of their own, fighting back in the only way she could. This discovery terrified the planter class. They'd always believed their slaves were generally content, or at least resigned to their fate. The idea that there was this much rage, this much desire for retribution simmering beneath the surface of obedience was existentially threatening. They found Rose's true chamber of horrors, too. Not a physical place, but a methodological journal hidden in a metal box buried near the bayou. Written in a mixture of French, Creole, and African symbols, it documented her methods in clinical detail. Which plants, which doses, which timing worked best, which types of mothers were most vulnerable to certain preparations. Notes on which families were cruelest, most deserving of this particular punishment. The journal was extraordinary, not just for its content, but for what it revealed about Rose herself. This was a highly intelligent, educated woman who taught herself botany, chemistry, and human physiology to a degree that rivaled trained physicians. She'd conducted what amounted to scientific experiments, refining her techniques over years. White authorities were stunned. This didn't match their understanding of what enslaved people were capable of. It suggested intelligence, planning, sophistication that their entire worldview said was impossible for people they considered barely human. The discovery of Rose's journal forced an uncomfortable reckoning. If one enslaved woman could be this brilliant, this dangerous, what did that say about all the others? Rose's real name, authorities discovered, was Rose Marie Laveau. No relation to the famous voodoo priestess, but that didn't stop rumors from swirling. She was 43 years old, born in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, in 1797, just as the Haitian Revolution was reaching its bloody climax. Her mother had been a healer who'd fought with the revolutionaries before being captured and sold to Louisiana planters. Rose had grown up hearing stories of Black Revolution, of enslaved people successfully overthrowing their white masters and creating their own nation. Those stories had shaped her entire worldview, She'd learned midwifery as a teenager, and by 20 she'd realized that the birthing room was a space of extraordinary power, intimate, unsupervised, with life and death hanging in the balance. She delivered her first stillborn to a white family at age 23. It had been unintentional then, a genuine tragedy. But she'd watched the master's grief and realized something profound. White people were just as helpless in the face of death as enslaved people. Their money and power couldn't protect them from this particular pain. That realization planted a seed that would grow into her campaign of revenge. Delphine's real story emerged too. She was Rose's younger cousin, 36 years old, who'd watched her own mother beaten to death for the crime of learning to read. Delphine had channels of rage so deep that Rose's plan had felt like divine justice when she first heard it. Delphine hadn't just helped. She'd actively encouraged Rose to expand her targets, to kill more, to hurt more white families. These weren't monsters. They were women who'd been so thoroughly dehumanized by slavery that they'd concluded the only way to reclaim their humanity was through the ultimate act of power, deciding who lives and who dies. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something that sent shockwaves far beyond Louisiana. Rose had been corresponding, through an elaborate network of enslaved people who could read and write, with other midwives and healers throughout the South. Letters had been smuggled between plantations, encoded in seemingly innocent messages about folk remedies and birthing techniques. These letters suggested that Rose wasn't unique. There were others using similar methods, conducting similar campaigns of silent resistance. In Mississippi, a midwife named Patience had attended 12 stillbirths among white families. In Alabama, a healer named Dinah was suspected of causing 7. In South Carolina, 3 enslaved midwives were under investigation for suspicious patterns. The network wasn't coordinated in any formal sense. There was no central authority giving orders. But these women were sharing knowledge, techniques, and moral support. They saw themselves as soldiers in an undeclared war, using the only weapons available to them. The scope was staggering. Authorities estimated, though they never proved, that as many as 200 white infant deaths across 5 states might have been deliberate acts of resistance by enslaved midwives. 200 families torn apart. 200 bloodlines interrupted. 200 secret murders committed by women's society considered too simple and docile to conceive of such acts. The revelation caused panic throughout the Southern planter class. Could they trust any enslaved healer? Could they continue to rely on enslaved midwives to deliver their children? The paranoia spread like wildfire. Here's what happened next, and this is crucial. The white establishment made a collective decision to suppress the story. Yes, Rose and Delphine would be punished severely. Examples had to be made. But the full scope of what they'd done, the intelligence and planning they'd demonstrated, the possibility of a wider network, that couldn't be allowed to become public knowledge. Why? Because the story undermined every justification for slavery. If enslaved people were intelligent enough to conduct sophisticated campaigns of resistance, if they had access to deadly knowledge and the cunning to use it undetected, then they clearly weren't the childlike, simple-minded creatures that slavery's defenders claimed they were. The truth of Rose's capabilities threatened the entire ideological foundation of the institution. More practically, widespread knowledge of Rose's methods would give other enslaved people ideas. It would make white families terrified of the very people they depended on for intimate care. It would destroy the fragile illusion of the happy plantation, where enslaved people were supposedly grateful for their master's benevolence. So the story was buried. Official records were altered. Parish documents were destroyed. Families who'd lost babies were pressured to never speak publicly about the circumstances. Newspapers were discouraged from covering the trial in detail. Rose and Delphine's executions would be public, but the reasons for them would be deliberately vague. Crimes against white families, rather than the specific, terrifying truth. The conspiracy of silence was remarkably effective. Within a generation, most people in Louisiana had only heard vague rumors about a murderous midwife. Within 2 generations, the story had been almost entirely erased. Rose and Delphine were executed by hanging on August 15, 1840, in front of a crowd of over 300 people, white and enslaved alike, forced to watch as a warning. Rose reportedly said nothing from the scaffold. Delphine screamed curses at the white families watching, condemning them all to hell for the sin of slavery. Both died within minutes. Their bodies were not returned for burial. Instead, following a practice reserved for the most dangerous criminals, they were taken to the Louisiana State Medical College and dissected for anatomical study, a final violation, a final way to deny them even the dignity of death. Harriet, whose machinations had led to their capture, was never suspected by white authorities, but the enslaved community knew what she'd done. She lived with their judgment for the rest of her life. Some called her a traitor, others a pragmatist who'd saved countless lives by stopping Rose before the backlash grew worse. She was sold to a plantation in Texas in 1842, possibly to escape the weight of her community's complicated feelings about her actions. She lived to see emancipation in 1865, but died shortly after, at age 63. James Sullivan, the overseer who'd first suspected Rose, never worked in plantation management again. The accusation had ruined his reputation, even though he'd been proven right. He moved to New Orleans and became a dock worker, drinking heavily, telling anyone who'd listen about the murderous midwife no one believed him about. He died in a tavern fight in 1847. The white families, who'd lost babies, struggled with complicated grief. They'd loved their children, yes, but now they had to confront the fact that those children had been deliberately murdered by someone they'd trusted, as an act of resistance against their way of life. Some families left Louisiana entirely, unable to live with the knowledge. Others doubled down on their commitment to slavery, seeing Rose's actions as proof that enslaved people were dangerous and needed even more brutal control. Rose's story raises questions we still don't know how to answer. Was she a hero or a villain? A freedom fighter or a baby killer? Can she be both? Is resistance justified when the only available weapon is the murder of innocents who happen to be born on the wrong side of history? The enslaved community of 1840s Louisiana was deeply divided. Some saw Rose as a warrior saint who'd struck a blow against their oppressors in the only way possible. Others saw her as someone who'd crossed a moral line that shouldn't be crossed, no matter the provocation. Many held both views simultaneously, unable to reconcile their admiration for her courage with their horror at her methods. What's undeniable is this: Rose's campaign forced white society to confront the rage that slavery generated, even if they quickly buried that confrontation. She proved that enslaved people had agency, intelligence, and the capacity for sophisticated resistance. She demonstrated that the power dynamic between master and slave was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Her legacy lived on in whispers and warnings. For decades after her death, white families in Louisiana would carefully vet any enslaved midwife before allowing them near a birthing mother. The paranoia Rose created outlasted her by generations. And secretly, in the slave quarters, her name became legend, a reminder that resistance could take many forms, that power could be seized even in the most unlikely circumstances. The moral of Rose's story isn't simple, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. It's a story about the brutality slavery inflicted on everyone it touched, the enslaved, certainly, but also the enslavers who created a system so horrific that it generated this kind of desperate, dark resistance. It's about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond all reasonable limits, when every legitimate path to freedom is blocked, when the only power left is the power to hurt back. So I'll leave you with Rose's questions, the ones she never got to ask from the scaffold. If you were enslaved, if you watched your children sold, your family destroyed, your body violated, your humanity denied, what would you do? If the only power you had was the power to make your oppressors feel a fraction of your pain, would you use it? Where is the line between resistance and atrocity, and who gets to decide? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're urgent ones, because versions of this story are still playing out today. Whenever people are systematically oppressed, whenever power is distributed so unjustly that normal forms of resistance are impossible, People find dark alternatives. They always have. They always will. Could something like Rose's campaign happen today? Would we even see it coming? Or would we, like the planters of 1840s Louisiana, be so certain of our own righteousness, so convinced of our superiority, that we'd miss the warning signs until it was too late? Rose Marie Laveau killed 31 babies to strike back at a system that had killed countless more through brutality, separation, and despair. History has buried her story because it's too uncomfortable, too morally ambiguous. But discomfort is where truth lives. And this truth, about resistance, about rage, about what slavery actually was, deserves to be remembered. Subscribe if you believe difficult histories deserve to be told. Comment below with your thoughts. I genuinely want to know. Was Rose a hero, a villain, or something far more complicated? Where would you draw the line? This is Shadow Stories, and some shadows never fade.